Welcome back, and thank you for joining us. Before we dive into what may be one of the most emotionally complex legacies in modern entertainment, I'd like to invite you to subscribe to the channel if you believe in looking beyond the headlines, questioning what we're told, and uncovering the deeper truth behind the personalities we thought we knew. Now let's talk about Norm Macdonald, not just as a comedian, but as a human puzzle. For decades, Norm Macdonald was hailed as one of the sharpest minds in American comedy, a master of irony, a genius of deadpan delivery, a man whose words could split a room between roaring laughter and stunned silence. He took risks with his humor, big ones, and he didn't care whether you laughed, cringed, or walked out. That was the persona he carefully constructed. But behind that calculated irreverence, there lived a private man fighting battles far from the spotlight. The story of Norm Macdonald isn't just about edgy jokes or late-night interviews. It's a story about silence, about secrecy, and about the weight of things unspoken. Norm was born in Quebec, Canada, in 1959, to a family of educators. But the order and discipline of his household didn't translate into emotional clarity. From an early age, he hinted at deep unease, particularly in recounting vague and unsettling childhood memories involving a man named Old Jack. Jack was employed by the family, lived on their property, and according to Norm's own reflections, was tied to a chapter of his life filled with confusion, fear, and trauma. What exactly happened between young Norm and this man was never fully disclosed, but the fragments he did share revealed panic attacks, memory loss, and a visceral reaction to Jack's death that suggested pain buried so deep it never truly healed. Why does this matter? Because if you understand Norm's discomfort with vulnerability, his insistence on keeping things buried under layers of sarcasm and absurdity, you begin to see the comedian not just as a provocateur but as a survivor of something unspoken. As Norm grew older, he didn't just tell jokes, he dissected the absurdity of existence. He was the kind of comic who didn't chase applause. In fact, he seemed to prefer confusion. But that same edge often led him into controversy. At Saturday Night Live, where he became the face of the satirical news segment, Weekend Update, his humor pushed boundaries that others were afraid to touch. He made light of taboos, took aim at public figures, and turned tragedies into punchlines. Some called it fearless. Others called it cruel. There was the joke about Brandon Tina, trans man who had been brutally assaulted and murdered. Norm misidentified Brandon's gender in a way that critics deemed offensive and unnecessary. Then there were his recurring jabs at O.J. Simpson during the trial that divided America. While many applauded Norm for speaking truth to power, others pointed out that these were real people, real victims, and real pain, not just setups for a punchline. And yet, NBC executives didn't seem to care much about the audience's discomfort until Norm's jokes allegedly hit too close to home. One executive in particular, Don Ohlmeyer, a friend of Simpson's, reportedly took offense to Norm's unrelenting commentary on the trial. Norm was eventually removed from his anchor position on Weekend Update. Officially, they said it was about ratings, but the timing raised eyebrows. Letterman and Howard Stern, both media giants, stood by Norm and hinted that something more political was at play. This is where things get complicated. On the one hand, Norm was a champion of unfiltered speech, someone who refused to bend to the cultural winds of his time. On the other hand, he wasn't just making people uncomfortable, was hurting them. Over the years, more stories came forward. Women in comedy spoke out about their experiences with Norm, suggesting moments of inappropriate behavior, boundary crossing, and discomfort. While none of these stories led to legal action, they painted a different image than the one most fans held. This duality, public genius, private complexity, is not unique in entertainment. But with Norm, The gap between the stage and the soul seemed impossibly wide. Even as his health deteriorated from a rare blood cancer, he kept secret for years. Norm never asked for pity. He told no one, not even close friends in the industry. Not because he was brave, but because he feared being seen as weak. Or worse, treated differently. He wanted to remain the Norm people expected, sharp, unflinching, defiant. And perhaps, beneath that defiance, was the same frightened boy who once sat in a shed behind his house, haunted by things he couldn't name. In his final years, Norm recorded a comedy special alone in his living room, knowing he might not make it to a stage again. No makeup, no audience, no edits, just his voice, a mic, and whatever truth he had left to give. When the special aired posthumously, many fans were moved, but others noticed how much was still unsaid. Is it fair to judge a man solely by the jokes he tells? Or should we look closer at the silences between them? As we unravel the layers of Norm Macdonald's life, we invite you to question what makes someone great. Is it their art, their integrity, their resilience? Or is greatness always tangled in contradictions, impossible to define, and even harder to understand? The answers aren't easy, but maybe that's the point. If you've made it this far, we'd love to hear what you think. Was Norm Macdonald a misunderstood icon or a man who crossed too many lines? Did he use comedy as a shield or as a sword? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another truth hiding in plain sight. In many ways, the fallout from Norm Macdonald's dismissal from Saturday Night Live marked the beginning of a different phase in his career, one shaped less by public acclaim and more by internal defiance. What remained consistent, however, was his refusal to adjust, apologize, or sanitize his work for the sake of comfort. If the network wanted polished and palatable, Norm doubled down on unpredictable and unsettling. But the story wasn't just about jokes gone too far. It was about power, perception, and the subtle mechanics of television politics. Don Ohlmeyer, the NBC executive said to have orchestrated Norm's removal from the Weekend Update desk, was reportedly unhappy with Norm's relentless satire of O.J. Simpson, a man Ohlmeyer had personal ties to. While Ohlmeyer publicly denied these claims, the timing felt too precise, the context too revealing. If Norm had gone after anyone else with the same intensity, would he have faced the same consequences? Or was this a lesson in what happens when comedy collides with privilege? Norm himself believed the answer was obvious. In interviews following his departure, he repeatedly insinuated that his firing was less about ratings and more about retribution. David Letterman and Howard Stern, two of the most influential voices in late-night media, publicly sided with him. Letterman, who had long admired Norm's originality, suggested that NBC had let go of one of the few comedians willing to challenge the status quo. Stern, known for his own confrontational style, went further, accusing the network of hypocrisy and cowardice. Yet through all of this, Norm remained an enigma. He didn't campaign for vindication. He didn't launch counterattacks. He simply kept doing what he did best, writing, performing, pushing buttons. And in doing so, he continued to divide public opinion. Some saw him as a crusader for artistic freedom. Others saw him as reckless, even cruel. But both sides missed a deeper layer. Norm wasn't just defying authority, he was reacting to a world that never quite made sense to him. The shift away from network television opened new doors. In 1999, he launched The Norm Show, a sitcom that ran for 3 seasons. It was lighter, more accessible, but still carried traces of his dry, offbeat delivery. Around the same time, he began venturing into voice acting, contributing to shows like Family Guy and The Fairly Odd Parents. He even appeared on the celebrity edition of Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, nearly winning the full prize. These weren't just career moves, they were a signal Norm hadn't been silenced. He had simply changed platforms. But success didn't quiet the storms. In fact, they grew louder. Norm's memoir, released in 2016, blurred the lines between fact and fiction so thoroughly that readers were left unsure what to believe. Some passages hinted at truth. Others read like satire wrapped in poetic metaphor. Critics were divided. One described the book as brilliantly evasive. Another called it a cry for help disguised as stand-up. The effect was the same. It deepened the mystery. Norm, perhaps sensing the rising cultural tension around political correctness and public accountability, shifted his approach in later years. He began to insist that he had no political opinions. He claimed comedy should remain apolitical, unburdened by outrage culture or social agendas. But that didn't stop him from making remarks that ignited controversy, most notably his commentary on the Me Too movement. He expressed concern that the movement was bypassing due process, that accusations were sometimes treated as convictions. He even defended Louis C.K., a fellow comedian accused of serious misconduct, saying it was unfair how quickly C.K.'s career had collapsed. These comments, though nuanced in Norm's mind, were seen by many as tone-deaf. Once again, Norm found himself under fire not because he had done something, but because he refused to align with the loudest voices in the room. It's important to ask, was Norm speaking out of ignorance, stubbornness, or something else entirely? Was he pushing back against cultural shifts he didn't understand? Or was he trying to preserve a fading idea of comedy, one where boundaries were meant to be challenged, not protected? The truth may lie somewhere in between. Norm often said that the role of the comedian wasn't to soothe or affirm, but to observe and exaggeratido, hold a funhouse mirror to society and let the audience decide what's real. But in a world increasingly concerned with representation, accountability, and empathy, that philosophy had grown controversial, and Norm, by choice or by nature, refused to adapt. Still, for every critic who accused him of insensitivity, there were countless comedians, some of the sharpest minds in the business, who credited him as an influence, a mentor, a visionary. Dave Chappelle dedicated the Closer to Norm's memory. Conan O'Brien, known for his own cerebral wit, called Norm's comedy pure brilliance. To them, he wasn't just another comedian, was a kind of philosopher, someone who understood the absurdity of existence and had the nerve to laugh at it. But even admiration didn't erase the growing discomfort around certain parts of Norm's legacy. Stories began to surface, some during his lifetime, others after. Comedians like Carrie Lendo and Jenny Young shared accounts that painted Norm as someone who, at times, crossed lines with women in the industry. A woman from Milwaukee claimed Norm had behaved inappropriately during a photo opportunity. None of these stories resulted in formal charges, but they added weight to a question that now shadows many legacies. Can we separate the artist from the man? And should we? It's a difficult question, one without clear answers. Norm never addressed these stories directly. He didn't apologize. He didn't deny. He simply stayed silent, as if to say, let the work speak louder than the noise. But silence, as we know, is its own kind of statement. And in today's culture, where silence can be interpreted as complicity, the absence of an answer often becomes part of the controversy. As this chapter of Norm's life unfolds, the tension only grows. What do we make of someone who seemed so committed to telling the truth on stage, yet so elusive about their own? Was Norm protecting himself or protecting the image he wanted the world to see? Did he fear vulnerability? Or did he simply believe it had no place in comedy? And more importantly, was he right? If the controversies surrounding Norm Macdonald's career were a matter of public debate, then what followed in his final decade was a secret known only to a few. While the world debated his words, dissected his intentions, and questioned his boundaries. Norm was quietly waging a battle that would outlast almost everything else, one that most people wouldn't even learn about until after his death. In 2013, Norm received a diagnosis that would change the course of his life. He had multiple myeloma, a form of cancer that attacks plasma cells in the bone marrow. It's not the kind of disease you can hide easily. Treatment is grueling, and symptoms eventually become impossible to ignore. But somehow, Norm kept it quiet. Not out of pride. Exactly. It seemed more like a matter of principle. According to his brother Neil and his closest collaborators, Norm didn't want sympathy. He didn't want to be pitied. He wanted to be remembered for his work, not for his illness. And so he told no one except a very small circle of family and trusted partners. There's a kind of haunting dignity in that choice. It speaks to a man who, despite his career of laying bare the uncomfortable truths of the world, refused to let the world peek into his own suffering. It also hints at a fear maybe of being reduced to a story he couldn't control. After all, when your profession is built on pushing narratives, the last thing you want is to become someone else's. But that secrecy came with a price. The toll of chemotherapy, the complications from stem cell treatment, and the progression of the disease were steadily chipping away at Norm's physical ability to live normally. By the mid-2010s, he was developing peripheral neuropathy, a condition caused by nerve damage that affected his ability to walk, stand, or even hold things steadily. The physicality that once underscored his subtle comedic timing was quietly fading. He could no longer play tennis or golf, hobbies he had once turned to for peace. Still, he kept performing. Still, he wrote. And still, the world had no idea. What's striking here is not just the secrecy but the intention behind it. Norm wasn't hiding from the world. He was, in a way, shielding the audience from having to confront their own discomfort with mortality. In one interview, he quipped, "If you die, the cancer dies at the same time. That's not a loss. That's a draw." The comment, like so many of his, walked the line between absurdity and profound existential clarity. It wasn't about being bravate, it was about making death palatable, even laughable. But behind that line was a man who knew time was slipping, and who didn't want to waste a second of it asking for pity. Then came a twist that even Norm didn't anticipate. After several rounds of treatment, his condition improved. The cancer went into remission, but it wasn't over. Doctors soon found signs of a new and different blood disorder, myelodysplastic syndrome, a condition that, left unchecked, could evolve into acute leukemia. So once again, he quietly began treatment, this time knowing the risks were even higher. But if illness was creeping into every corner of his life, Norm refused to let it define his work. In fact, he was preparing something else, something final. During the COVID-19 pandemic, while the world was adjusting to lockdowns and distance, Norm began working on a new comedy special. Not just material, but a complete, hour-long performance. There was only one problem. He wasn't sure he'd live long enough to perform it in front of an audience. So, in the most poetic and tragic act of creative willpower, he recorded the special alone in his living room. One take. No audience. No polish. Just Norm, sitting with a microphone, pouring out what would become his final performance. It was raw, honest, uneasy at times, and yet, in that solitary space, he somehow managed to distill everything he stood for as a comic: wit without apology, truth without sentiment, and discomfort without shame. That recording was kept secret for months, known only to a few people at Netflix and Norm's management. When it was eventually released posthumously, it didn't just feel like a final act, it felt like a message in a bottle. A farewell disguised as another bit, another monologue, another philosophical detour told with a crooked smile. And the reactions were as divided as you might expect. Some called it brilliant. Others called it painful to watch. But in both responses, there was a shared recognition. We were watching a man say goodbye without saying it. We were being given access not to a polished performance, but to a private reckoning. This choicito perform without the audience he once thrived owns perhaps the most telling part of Norm's final years. For someone who built a life on making others laugh, he spent his last act staring into a lens, knowing no laughter would come back to him. That silence wasn't just literal, it was symbolic. It was the sound of a man who had nothing left to prove, and no time left to waste. But just as Norm's illness had periods of remission, so too did his desire to return to normal. At several points, he expressed hope that he might recover enough to perform the special properly on stage. His friends and colleagues supported this vision, encouraged it. But the reality of cancer is merciless. After contracting an infection during his final round of treatments, his condition deteriorated rapidly. In July 2021, Norm had been fighting cancer in secret for nearly a decade. 2 months later, on September 14th, he died from complications related to acute leukemia. He was 61 years old, and when the news broke, it came as a shock to almost everyone, not because death was a surprise in the grand scheme of things, but because Norm had hidden it so well. For so long, even in death, he kept the punchline close to the chest. This silence, this radical privacy, leaves us with a strange kind of grief. It challenges us to reassess not just Norm's legacy, but how we think about suffering, performance, and the roles we expect our public figures to play. Why did he keep it all a secret? Was it pride? Was it protection? Or was it something deeper, a statement about how we consume pain in the era of public disclosure? Norm Macdonald didn't let his illness become part of his brand. He didn't monetize it. He didn't package it as inspiration. And in doing so, he may have made his most powerful statement yet, that even in a world obsessed with vulnerability, some truths still deserve to remain private. What followed Norm Macdonald's death was as complex and polarizing as the man himself. The news came quietly, with no grand announcement, no drawn-out farewell tour, no televised battle against illness. Just a single, chilling update: Norm was gone. And suddenly, the world was left with a silence it didn't know how to process. For years, Norm had occupied an unusual space in comedy, neither a mainstream darling nor an underground rebel. He was too smart for simple applause, too unpredictable for formulaic praise. So when his passing was confirmed in September 2021, it didn't just mark the end of a career. It triggered a reckoning. People began to sift through what he left behind, not just in terms of punchlines, but in terms of meaning. Among his peers, tributes poured in almost immediately. Dave Chappelle, during the filming of his Netflix special The Closer, dedicated the performance to Norm. He didn't offer a long eulogy. He didn't dramatize Norm's final days. He simply acknowledged that a light had gone out, a light that many in the industry had quietly depended on for decades. Conan O'Brien, another longtime friend and collaborator, was visibly shaken when remembering Norm. On his podcast, he spoke candidly about how Norm could take a joke that seemed destined to fail and land it perfectly with timing no one else could replicate. But Conan didn't just celebrate Norm's comedy, he acknowledged the layers beneath it. There was a sadness in him, he said, that gave his humor its bite. And this point deserves pause, because Norm's comedy wasn't reactive, it was reflective. He didn't shout down the world. He held up a mirror and let the silence do most of the work. It's why so many comedians revered him. To them, he wasn't just funny, he was fearless in a way they quietly envied. But the public response wasn't universally warm. As headlines praised his genius, other voices, especially from women in the comedy world, began to speak up again. These were not new accusations, but in the wake of his passing, they gained new weight. Carrie Lindo, a stand-up comedian who had worked in the same circles as Norm, noted that her memories of him weren't positive. She didn't offer graphic details. She didn't call for his erasure. But her tone was clear. Her experiences didn't match the praise being offered so freely. Around the same time, Jenny Young, another respected comedian and activist, resurfaced older allegations and invited others to share their own stories. Her social media post wasn't accusatory in the legal sense. It was observational, reflective, and open invitation for accountability. And soon, others responded. One woman, who identified herself only as Molly from Milwaukee, shared that during a fan photo with Norm, he had touched her in a way that made her feel deeply uncomfortable. None of these claims were ever litigated. They didn't reach the courtroom. They weren't dissected on primetime. But they existed in comments, in posts, in DMs, and their presence created a quiet but undeniable split. Those who wanted to remember Norm for his brilliance, and those who needed to speak their truth, even if the world wasn't ready to hear it. This is the contradiction we now live with. On one side, a trailblazing performer, a singular voice in a landscape that often punishes originality. On the other, a man whose personal interactions left some people unsettled, unheard, and in some cases, harmed. The question isn't whether Norm was guilty or innocent. That's not ours to determine. The deeper question is what we do when the people we admire leave behind legacies that don't align neatly. In a time when social consciousness demands moral clarity, how do we process figures who exist in shades of gray? In the years prior to his death, Norm's commentary often touched on that very theme. He spoke about the shifting culture of outrage, the acceleration of moral judgment, and the erasure of nuance in public discourse. He didn't always land on the right side of these conversations. But what's undeniable is that he engaged with them. Even when he said things that upset people, even when he tried to defend others like Louis C.K. He wasn't offering blanket defenses. He was raising questions about process, about consequences, about how fast we're allowed to destroy a person before the facts are fully known. Was he out of step with the times? Probably. But was he malicious? That part is less clear. What is clear is that Norm Macdonald was never easily digestible. He didn't fit neatly into categories of hero or villain, victim or perpetrator. He existed on the margins, observing, critiquing, distorting, and that's where he felt most comfortable. It's also where he made the most people uncomfortable. This discomfort is now a part of his legacy. It sits beside the laughs, beside the accolades, beside the carefully worded obituaries. It forces us to reconsider how we remember public figures. Do we honor their impact and overlook their flaws? Or do we demand a full reckoning even if it comes after they're gone? There's no easy answer. Some argue that legacy is earned through craft, not character. Others insist that how someone treats people matters more than how clever their words are. And perhaps both are true. Perhaps greatness is allowed to be messy, incomplete, and unresolved. Norm once said, "Comedy is surprise. It's the opposite of analysis." And yet, here we are analyzing him, questioning him, re-evaluating the parts of his story that were never part of the act. Because in the end, when someone makes their living challenging the truth, it's only fair that we challenge theirs in return. In the aftermath of Norm Macdonald's death and the divided reaction that followed, a larger question emerged, one that stretched far beyond the man himself. What is the role of comedy in a culture increasingly preoccupied with moral clarity? And where do we draw the line between artistic freedom and social responsibility? Norm didn't just tell jokes. He constructed contradictions. He made you laugh and squirm in the same breath. And whether you admired him or not, you couldn't ignore the way he made you feel something, often something you didn't expect. In a time where audiences crave authenticity but also demand accountability, Norm existed in an uncomfortable middle ground. He wasn't confessional in the trendy sense. He wasn't trying to be likable. He was trying to be honest, but on his terms. This idea of honesty, particularly in comedy, is more complex than it sounds. For Norm, honesty didn't mean vulnerability or moral correctness. It meant calling things what they were even when it felt impolite, even when it challenged the zeitgeist. And that's why his humor often rubbed against the grain of whatever dominant narrative was circulating at the time. But culture shifted, and as movements like Me Too and cancel culture gained momentum, comedy found itself under a microscope. Audiences began to question not just what comedians were saying, but what they stood for. Could a joke be separated from the person who delivered it? Could satire still exist if it poked at wounds too fresh to laugh at? Norm never gave a clear answer. In fact, he actively resisted giving answers. When asked about cancel culture, he would often deflect not out of fear, but because he fundamentally rejected the premise that comedy had to be approved before it could be performed. He didn't believe comedians were moral leaders. He believed they were observers, fallible, flawed, but useful because of it. And in many ways, that's what made him dangerous. Norm wasn't interested in safe spaces. He wasn't there to uplift. He wasn't there to teach. He was there to provoke. And for many, that alone was enough to dismiss him. But for others, especially within the comedy world, was a reminder that the art form once thrived on risk, on ambiguity, on discomfort. To younger comics who grew up in the post-cancellation era, Norm represented something both aspirational and out of reach: the ability to speak freely without filtering yourself through social consensus. But for those who experienced his darker side, the uncomfortable moments, the blurred boundaries, the lingering question, she represented something else entirely: the hidden cost of giving one person too much leeway in the name of genius. This is the paradox we're left with. Norm's brand of comedy was not meant to be digestible. It was meant to challenge and sometimes offend. But in that process, he exposed something bigger about our relationship to public figures. We want them to be real, but not too real. We want them to push boundaries, but only in ways that align with our values. We celebrate rebelliousness until it goes somewhere we can't follow. And Norm went there. Repeatedly. He made jokes about death, about violence, about people in the headlines who were supposed to be untouchable. He made jokes about his own failures, his gambling addiction, his emotional isolation. But he also stayed silent about the things we now ask celebrities to confront: apologies, reflection, growth. He didn't offer those. Whether that was a lack of awareness or a conscious choice, we can't know. But it left a vacuum, one that critics were quick to fill. And yet, here's the uncomfortable truth: Norm Macdonald's comedy, at its best, functioned like a kind of cultural stress test. His material pushed past the surface reactions and into the places people didn't want to go. Not because he enjoyed cruelty, but because he refused to flatten complex truths into moral slogans. He forced you to sit in the tension. In an era dominated by virtue signaling and curated empathy, that refusal stood out. It made people uncomfortable not just because of what he said, but because of what it revealed. That perhaps we've grown so accustomed to polished messaging, we've forgotten how to wrestle with something raw, unsorted, and unfiltered. That's not to excuse or glorify every choice Norm made. It's simply to acknowledge that his approach illuminated something about us: our unease with ambiguity, our hunger for resolution, and our tendency to erase those who don't fit neatly into the roles we assign them. This is why his legacy is still being debated, not just in think pieces and social media threads, but in green rooms, writers' rooms, and classrooms where comedy is taught as both art and artifact. He is a case study in what happens when brilliance and discomfort collide, when humor refuses to behave, when truth-telling becomes a form of rebellion, not reassurance. And perhaps that's why so many comedians, even those who disagreed with Norm personally, still speak about him with a kind of reverence. Not because he was perfect, but because he was fearless. And in an industry where careers can collapse in a single misstep, fearlessness has become a rare and endangered trait. Norm once joked that the worst thing you could say about a person today is that they're problematic. Not evil, not dangerous, just problematic. And he wasn't wrong. That label has become the modern scarlet letter, vague enough to apply broadly, sharp enough to damage reputations without the burden of evidence. But what if being problematic is exactly what made Norm effective? What if the value of his work lies not in its cleanliness, but in its messiness and its refusal to offer closure? As the world continues to redefine what it means to be good, to be acceptable, to be allowed, Norm Macdonald remains frozen in a different era. An era where a comedian could be complicated, contradictory, even uncomfortable, and still be heard. And so we come to the end of the story, or at least to the part where the person at the center is no longer here to shape it. What remains is a collection of performances, interviews, controversies, whispers, and tributes, all competing to define who Norm Macdonald really was. But what if the story doesn't need to be defined? What if it's more honest to let it remain fractured? Because the truth is, legacy isn't what we leave behind, it's what others choose to remember. And in Norm's case, those choices vary widely. For some, he's an icon, a purist who never compromised, never catered, and never played it safe. A man whose humor lived in the uncomfortable spaces, where laughter didn't come easy, but when it did, it lingered longer. For others, he's a cautionary tale, a figure whose brilliance couldn't excuse the ways he made people feel invisible, dismissed, or disrespected. Neither view is fully wrong, but neither is fully complete. What makes Norm's legacy especially difficult to frame is that he didn't try to control it. Most public figures, particularly in today's media environment, become experts at managing their image. They release memoirs, produce documentaries, launch apology tours, and reframe their mistakes into lessons. Norm did none of that. His memoir blurred fact and fiction until it was impossible to tell which was which. His interviews, when asked about controversies, often drifted into misdirection or abstract deflection. He wasn't hiding the truth. He was refusing to package it. That refusal, the same one that defined his stand-up, his writing, and even his last filmed special, forces us to engage with him differently. We can't just accept or reject. We have to wrestle with the discomfort, with the brilliance, with the silence. And in doing so, we're left not with a neat ending, but with an open question. Can we admire someone without excusing their blind spots? Can we acknowledge harm without erasing talent? And more than that, do we even know how to remember someone honestly anymore? In a culture that often demands absolute heroes or absolute villains, it's tempting to close a story like Norm's with resolution, to say he was misunderstood, or that he paid a private price for a public voice, or that he meant well, even when he missed the mark. But maybe none of that is necessary. Maybe Norm's real contribution wasn't his fearlessness, or his refusal to apologize, or even his jokes. It was his commitment to the unresolved, to leaving room for contradiction, to showing us that not everything needs to be redeemed to be meaningful. There's a moment worth revisiting. It wasn't televised. It wasn't part of a famous set. It happened during a quiet interview. Years before his death, Norm was asked about regret. The interviewer expected a joke, but instead, Norm paused, looked down, and said, softly, "I think I've hurt people without knowing it." He didn't elaborate. He didn't follow it with a punchline. Just that one sentence. And maybe, in a strange way, it was the most revealing thing he ever said. because it stripped away the performance and left only the man who understood that impact doesn't require intention. That words can echo longer than you expect. That even a comedian, built on observation and timing, can miss what's right in front of him. We don't talk much about that kind of regret anymore. We talk about scandal, cancellation, vindication, but we rarely sit with the quiet realization that we can cause harm just by being who we are. Norm, whether consciously or not, lived in that space. And maybe that's why his work resonates so deeply even now. Because he never pretended to be anything but conflicted. It's easy to admire people who are clear, who pick a side, who apologize or rebel or reform in ways that are legible. But what do we do with someone like Norm who didn't offer clarity, who didn't give us the tools to defend or condemn him without complication? We do what he did. We observe. We sit with the tension. We acknowledge that people are rarely one thing, that humor can come from darkness, that genius and insensitivity can share the same stage, and that sometimes the most honest thing you can say about someone is that you don't fully know how to feel about them. In that sense, Norm Macdonald may have left us with more than just jokes. He left us with a challenge: to remember without erasing, to listen without idolizing, to laugh, even when we don't fully understand why. And maybe, just maybe that's the most human thing he ever did. Maybe the hardest thing to accept is that some stories don't end neatly. They don't offer closure. They don't give us heroes to cheer for or villains to condemn. Instead, they leave behind fragments sharp, unfinished, impossible to fit together without drawing blood. And perhaps that's what Norm Macdonald was. In the end, not a legend, not a monster, but a mirror. One that didn't flatter, one that didn't lie, one that made us question what we really find funny and what we're willing to look away from when someone makes us laugh. He never asked for our approval. He didn't beg for understanding. He simply existed on the edge, half in shadow, half in spotlight, telling truths we didn't always want to hear, and hiding ones we may never fully uncover. And so the question remains, how do we remember someone who never let us fully know him? Do we honor the art and ignore the harm? Do we confront the harm and risk forgetting the art? Or do we finally admit that memory is messy, that truth has edges, and that the most uncomfortable legacies are the ones we need most to sit with? Thank you for staying with us to the end. And if you believe in peeling back the layers, asking the harder questions, and seeking what lies beyond the applause, subscribe to this channel so you don't miss a single truth that's been kept in the dark. We'll see you in the next one.